Thanks, Cathaoirleach. I'm grateful for the opportunity to make a brief contribution today in this important piece of legislation, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2016. Of course, it will amend the Misuse of Drugs Act 1977 by adding new substances to the control list and make provision for a number of related matters, such as the revocation of some statutory instruments, the transferring of functions on granting licences to the Health Products Regulatory Authority from the Minister for Health, and adding the definitions of registered nurse and registered midwife to those allowed to administer medical prescriptions. I suppose the speedy progression of the bill, Cathaoirleach, through this House is part of the Government's attempt to take some action on the resurgence of gangland crime on the streets of Dublin, which we had a few debates about, indeed, since the general election. I note that the bill was originally scheduled for the autumn term and was also intended to provide for the establishment, of course, of the supervised injection centres. Obviously, it's regrettable, Minister, that full intention of original legislation is not there. I understand that will be brought forward in a subsequent Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill later in the term. And the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2016 is expected to aid by the Government to aid on Garda Síochána in the law enforcement duties regarding the possession of drugs and illicit substances. And the Minister, of course, has stated that the Gardaí specifically requested these powers as part of that fight against gangland activity. But I accept that the very sincere arguments and points of view that have been expressed here by colleagues in relation to decriminalisation, Minister, is worthy of very deep thought. And is worthy of the strongest consideration of this House at the next stage of this bill. So Section 6, Parts 1 and 2 sets out the schedule and the substances to be added to paragraph 1A and 1B of the schedule to the Misuse of Drugs Act 1977. And the types of substances to be added include the Z drugs, clockwork orange and other substances which have been identified as dangerous under the EU's Council decision 2005/387/JHA. Of course, some of those substances listed, such as zopiclone, may be in the possession of legitimate users with a prescription, and such regulations, of course, would be required to allow such possession. But with another shooting in broad daylight last week, Minister, I think we can agree that tackling gang activity and crime has to be a priority for the Government and our law enforcement agencies. I recently received a reply to a parliamentary question I raised regarding Garda Síochána's Operation Thistle. And Operation Thistle was set up in direct response to the escalation in gang violence in Dublin earlier this year. It commenced on the 19th of February, and as of the end of May this year, €1,794,000 worth of drugs had been seized. 12 persons have been arrested relating to the sale and supply of drugs, forged documents and breach of bail conditions, and 9 persons have been charged with 40 separate offences. It has to be said, though, Minister, I think you'll agree, because you're as much aware, representing a Dublin constituency like myself, of the horrendous impact of the godfathers of drug-fuelled crime, that the horrendous impact that it has on our communities, and the absolute necessity to go after those people and effectively to disrupt and end their business, and in fact to ensure that they will be brought to account for what they've done to our city and our country. And it has been regrettable, I think, that your colleague, the Minister for Justice, I feel has been slow in particularly liaising with our EU colleagues in countries like Spain and Holland, and utilising the European arrest warrant, the role of Europol, in order to literally take the long arm of our state after the alleged perpetrators of these incredible and outrageous assassinations on the streets of our city. So I would urge you again to be prepared to take whatever steps are necessary to progress that and to ensure that every one of those criminals who committed those horrendous crimes are brought to account, and especially the directors of that criminality. So while I welcome aspects of the intention of the bill, Minister, and certain actions being taken by the Government in an attempt to support on Garda Síochána, this bill needs to be more than just a knee-jerk reaction some colleagues have criticised, that won't make any real impact on the growing terror on the streets of the gangs who have no regard for the lives of anybody. And it's not surprising, Minister, of course, that we've seen the resurgence of such crimes, given the cutbacks of the austerity years, the negative impacts of the cutbacks on our communities, often some of the most lowest income and most deprived communities in our country. They're now being felt most acutely among those the people of those districts. In May 2015, for example, I asked the then Minister for State with responsibility for drugs, Deputy now Senator Eann Reardon, for information on the cuts in relation to the local drug and alcohol task forces and regional drug and alcohol task forces from 2011-2015, and their groups, of course, that you and I have strongly supported over the years. The local task force funding across Dublin reduced from 20.38 million in 2011 down to 18.947 million in 2015, and the percentage reduction in 2011 was 2.5%, another nearly 2% in 2012, 3.5% in 2013, 2% in 2014. I mean, we just couldn't afford those kind of cuts, as you know, again, from your own experience in your own constituency. There were so many positive projects that needed additional funding rather than in actual fact to be trying to constantly cope with reduced resources. And regional task force funding, of course, reduced from just under €10 million in 2011 down to well under 9 million in 2015. And at the end of December last year, I also requested information from the Minister for Health on the number of persons who availed of public addiction services, and the National Drug Treatment Reporting System, the NDTRS data available at the time for 2014 showed that approximately 16,500 cases entered drug or alcohol treatment, and of these 4.1% were categorised as having received detoxification, and a further 1.4% benzodiazepine detoxification, and 25% of all cases were treated as inpatient facilities. Figures provided in that PQ also stated at the end of June 2015 there were 249 people nationally on a waiting list in 38 HSE clinics with a mean waiting time of 1.2 months. So quite a considerable wait for people who are still trying to get assistance with detoxification. And you remember we had battles in the last Dáil and the previous Dáil to try and increase the number of the beds for that purpose. On 23rd of June 2016 I received a reply regarding a PQ I raised on the number of inpatient detox beds available, and the HSE told me that the number of beds then, including private provision, are 787 residential, comprising 23 inpatient unit detoxification beds, 117 community-based residential beds, 4 adolescent and 625 residential rehabilitation beds, and 18 adolescent rehabilitation. But it went on to state that the HSE is submitting a business case for additional treatment episodes in the estimates for 2017. So this will obviously be the challenge for yourself and your colleagues when the final shape of the budget takes place in late August and early September. But given the tens of thousands accessing treatment according to the NDTRS, I think there is still a clearly demonstrated need, Minister, for extra resources. Now, as other colleagues have referred, Senators Lynn Rowan and Eann Reardon, of course, they submitted amendments to this bill when it was before the Seanad recently, providing for the non-prosecution for possession for personal use, and that was in the context, obviously, where the criminal activity of major drug dealing is, still the very high responsibility and high intention, if you like, of this government to bring to an end. But they did submit amendments in that regard, and the newly appointed Minister for State for Equality, Migration and Integration, your colleague Minister David Stanton, I think he's also called, I saw him recently on a primetime programme, I think, for decriminalisation and to follow Portugal's system of non-prosecution for small amounts of drugs in personal possession for personal use. And I think Minister Stanton, I have to say, he's been, I think, in the Dáil all the period that I've been here myself, and is one of the most thoughtful and hard-working Dáil deputies, and now finally a minister. He's, I think it was his own committee, wasn't it, Minister, who the Justice Committee, who did make an intense study of the situation, I think, in Portugal, and visited Portugal and so on, and looked at the impacts of what had happened there. And they found, I think, that instead of tying up the court service in Portugal, persons are instead directed to the dissuasion centre to support them to discontinue their drug use. Senator Broughan, of course, also recently criticised the bill as retrograde and regressive, stating that it doesn't target the high-level dealers. In other words, we're not going after those people sufficiently strongly. But those two, the Progressive Senators' amendments were defeated, but I would hope to see the Minister for Communities and the National Drug Strategy consider a similar amendment going forward based on the work of his own committee under his chairperson, 31st Dáil. I mean, I'd also like to see if yourself and Deputy Staunton, could bring to the House, the data and facts of how the Portuguese, if you like, situation has developed. Also, Uruguay, we've read a lot indeed with the election, I think, of their current president or the last president. It was part of his portfolio to try and reduce serious criminality in Montevideo and in that country's, if you like, social life. And it's also an interesting, of course, development in some of the American states like Colorado and in Washington State, I think, and there is data, coming forward in relation to young people and drugs in all of those jurisdictions, and does seem to be very positive data about less young people being affected in, for example, the state of Colorado. So I think all of that does deserve urgent study and consideration by the government. I note that the number of Gardaí attached to the Divisional Drugs Unit in the Dublin Metropolitan Region was 113 in 2013, 106 in 2014, 115 in 2015, and the Coolock district alone in my own constituency seized drugs valued at over €3 million in 2014. Statistics from the CSO, of course, on the number of controlled drug offences where the suspected offenders are on bail show a huge jump in the number of offences year on year from 2003 to 2008. But in 2009, the numbers started to reduce to 2,353 in 2010, lower still at 2,154, and down in 2013 to 1,565. And that trend, of course, but the increased trend has returned with the number of recorded controlled drug offences where the suspected offender was on bail at 1,883 in 2014 and 1,940 in 2015. So it does show, I think, Minister, that, if you like, the so-called war on drugs is far from over, and the prevalence of drugs in our prisons, of course, must also be addressed. And it does show the need, I suppose, for significant new thinking and new responses to try and end this scourge on our communities. At the recent Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice launch of its report, Developing Inside, Transforming Prison for Young Adults, Father Peter McVerry, long-standing and deeply respected advocate for marginalised groups, of course, spoke of drugs in prison. Father McVerry said it's becoming more evident that heroin is the older prisoners' drug of choice and that the misuse of tablets has become much more popular. This, of course, is having a huge impact on the management of prisoners misusing this type of drug, as they're much more volatile, aggressive and unpredictable than the previous experience of prisoners misusing opiates and displaying more, if you like, cooperative behaviours. I welcome the Irish Prison Service's implementation of incentivised regimes and integrated sentence management, Minister, where those who become drug-free in prison and display positive behaviour are moved to enhanced regimes. However, I note that, and this again goes back to the resources we have to address this problem, that Mountjoy Prison has just 9 places on the drug-free unit on the drug-free programme in its medical unit. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, EMCDDA, noted that in Ireland in 2014, of the 9,523 persons who accessed treatment, 50% was for opiate addiction, 28% was for cannabis, 9% was for cocaine. The average age of those entering treatment was 30 years, and males made up 73% of the clients, and just 27% were females. Europol also recently published its EU Drugs Market Report 2016, which found that, and I quote, Irish teenagers and young adults are the biggest users of illegal psychoactive drugs in the EU, and you probably saw that report as well, Minister. Ireland had 9% level of use among the 15-24 age group who took part in the survey, so a very worrying statistic. And France and Spain both, for example, had 8%, Slovenia had 7%. So in conclusion, Minister, I welcome those efforts which have taken place so far to try to address increased gangland activity. We absolutely have to insist that that behaviour, that outrageous criminal behaviour, is ended, and the streets of our capital, are safe for residents and visitors. Serious action has to be taken, of course, to target the high-level dealers who are wreaking havoc on our streets and communities with no regard for life. And most importantly, I think a lesson, Minister, must be learned from the imposition of the austerity cuts, that there are repercussions from such decisions, and the longer-term cost, of course, can far outweigh the initial exchequer savings at the time. It's just interesting, yesterday in the UK, of course, the whole nation, or the four nations there, if you like, that are still in the United Kingdom, they were considering the impact of mistaken policy by officials in a very serious matter, obviously, in the Iraq War. The concern was that there isn't an accountability. Likewise, I think, for what happened to our country from 2006, 7, 8, 9, in both the regime that existed up to 2008, 9, and which led our country into an economic crash, and so the subsequent very vicious austerity which was implemented by the governments in the last two Dáils, that there should be an accounting, I think, for that, because we have seen the impact on our streets, in our communities, at the end of the day, from a regression from the progress that we were making. Initially, a lot of that progress, of course, in this area, in the subject matter of this bill, made by valiant community leaders, as we know, in the drugs task force and in all the community centres around our city and other cities around the country. On that note, Cathaoirleach, thanks.
Deputy Broughan, now Colin.